Welcome to the third part of this video series about coaching on real problems using CoachMaster software. My name is Bob Griffiths and I've created this series of videos using real coaching issues to illustrate how CoachMaster can support coaches as they actually run sessions. If you saw the first and second part of the video called Karen Parts 1 and 2, you will have seen me working with a young mother we've called Karen who had some issues getting her children out of the house in the morning. We have completed the goal, session goal, reality and obstacles stages of the coaching process, and we're now moving on to the options and way forward stages. You might also have seen that Karen had given me a lot of information about herself and the family dynamics. What I had discovered was there was a lot of complex family dynamics going on, and it was certainly not a straightforward problem. If you're viewing this video from a business viewpoint rather than a life coaching aspect, then just consider how many business situations involve one person trying to get another to change, often feeling victimized by the other person, trying to find ways to get them to change without jeopardizing the relationship, or feeling they should be in control but are not. All the same issues are being played out here. We left the last video at the point where Karen and I had agreed what the obstacles were to her getting her sons out of the house in a non-stressful way and on time. As you can see, the obstacles were mostly Karen's internal obstacles about how she was and how she felt the boys should relate to her, but they were not playing the roles she felt they should play. I was noticing this and thinking about how I could work with Karen to help her see the key to change was to change how she was behaving rather than repeat the same failing pattern again and again. I started this by asking Karen a simple question about what would be the first step around the obstacles. My hope was that she would see the patterns and realize the necessity for her to change. In her reply, she seemed to have really got the idea about how the vicious circle was operating, but she did not immediately know what to do about it. At this point, I was really tempted to go in with solutions, but I knew it would be much better if Karen devised them for herself. So I made up this question about what she could do differently in how she reacted to conflict. Karen tells me this is an old pattern, which I suspected but did not really want to go into as it was too far in the past for a coaching session. But it did reinforce what I was thinking, that Karen had problems knowing and standing up for what she wanted. But she did not really answer my question. So rather than try and force her to go the way I wanted, I stepped back and tried another approach with a question from this section on others' solutions. This section is designed to help the client think about how somebody else would deal with the situation. It is a classic coaching strategy to ask the client to think about how somebody, for instance, they admire would deal with a particular situation. For some reason, when we put the person into a different perceptual position, they're able to access information that they're not able to think of just as themselves. As you can see, I asked Karen the question and reference it back to the person she mentioned in the obstacles section, who was good at getting her children out on time. This is another advantage of having a complete dialogue to refer to, as you can easily go back and check the dialogue for what was said. Karen acknowledges that this person does get places on time with their kids, but seems to be saying she's not a role model that Karen wants to follow, so I try another tack. The magic wand question comes from the resources needed section of the option stage. It's often very useful in freeing the client when they're stuck in circular or restrictive thinking. By calling on magic, sometimes the client is able to see options they could not see before, and while many ideas are impractical, it's surprising how many times an idea comes from this question that can be used in some way. As you can see from Karen's answer, the question does seem to free up some thinking. She starts to think about who at the school gates is also good at getting their children there on time. This makes her think about her sister, and although she says her sister does not care about people's feelings, she does think that she could use her as a reference point. I suggest to Karen that she could ask her sister for some advice, and she agrees that this is an option. I now decide to go directly to an issue which seems to be coming through in all of Karen's answers. It seems to me that she's taking all the responsibility for making everything happen, and I decide to gently confront her with a direct question about it. This again is something you learn through experience while coaching. If you notice a trend or a tendency in a person's answers, or they seem to be revealing an underlying belief about themselves or others, then you as a coach have to decide whether to stick strictly to the process or discuss it with them. So in this case, I decided to ask Karen directly. As you can see from her answer, she suspected that she was doing too much for her children. I then suggested that she could leave them to face the consequences of their actions a bit more. Karen replies very honestly that she's concerned about how she will look at the school gates. I then ask if her concern about looking good could be another obstacle, and she agrees that it could be. I then ask Karen to reflect on what she's learned. I then use this question from the personal change section for Karen to think about. What's the single thing she could do that would make the most difference? She then tells me that spending time on those issues is a waste of time. I would agree with her, but that was not exactly what I was after. I wanted to try and find some practical actions that Karen could take which would alleviate this situation. So I asked her to think about what she would do differently in a practical sense. She replies that she has to decide on a baseline for behaviour, but she is still concerned about how she would look at the school gate. I could sense that I was still not getting the clear practical actions I was looking for. My next question suggested a route that she could go down. I was aware that it did have an implicit suggestion in it, but I felt I was not getting very far with Karen coming up with her own ideas. She then told me about a threat that she'd made to her older son, which I was pretty sure was a bad idea. We all know that kind of power struggles that go on in families with threats and counter-threats. So in my response, I was trying hard not to make Karen wrong, but to get her to think about letting go of control and thinking about other options. Karen then tells me that she's not sure, but instead of rescuing her with my own ideas, I invite her to take more time to reflect. She then starts suggesting ways that she could delegate some items. This to me seems to be an adult way of dealing with the situation, so I encourage her to tell me more. She comes up with the idea of one son making the toast, which seems a really good movement, as Karen is no longer trying to do everything herself and feeling like a victim when it doesn't happen. So I asked her to build on that idea. This is another good coaching principle, that if something seems to be working, or the client is pursuing a useful line of thought, it's worth keeping that on track and see if you can use that information or ideas or insight in another way. Karen then comes back to me with a rather vague idea of asking her older child to do something, but it seemed the best we were going to do at this moment, so I accepted it and summarised the discussion for the options stage, as usual asking Karen if she wanted to add anything. Karen then gives me her agreement, so I summarise the options in CoachMaster. We could then finally move on to the way forward or action stage. I try and move the discussion on a bit by suggesting a timescale for Karen to do most of the to-dos, which she accepts. We then come to the most difficult option. I was aware when I suggested it that it would not be easy to convert it into a to-do, because look at is pretty vague. But I decided to ask Karen first what she thought she might do about it, as suggestions from the clients are nearly always better than the coach putting their own ideas forward. But Karen could not come up with an idea, so I offered her a simple monitoring exercise. If you don't have an immediate way forward with a client, then suggesting a way they can monitor their behaviour or thoughts often leads to progress, as it raises their awareness of a pattern they want to change. I tried to ensure that Karen would not use it to beat herself up by explaining the exercise was about awareness rather than instantly stopping a behaviour. Karen liked the idea, so I set a time boundary around it, so she was clear she would not have to do it forever. I then summarised the to-do section. I had another look through the sections on support, consequences and commitment, but did not think they were very relevant to Karen at this moment in time. But I did want to check with Karen that she'd got what she wanted from the session. She came back to me to say it seemed a good step forward and I was ready to accept it. I had a look at the client and coach reflection questions, but I felt it would be more helpful for Karen to reflect on what she'd learned. But on a purely practical level, it had been a long session and I wanted to give her and me a break. What I would like her to have seen and what we looked at when we returned to it at the next session was that her old patterns of behaviour were not working for her, but it was within her power to change them. Reflecting on the session now, I think it would have been useful to recognise a few coaching lessons out of the work. Firstly, on one level, it is about how a stressed mother having to deal with all her kids when they're not cooperating very well is a very tough place to be. On another level, it has lessons for us all about several issues. Firstly, how to deal with others when you don't have direct power over them or they don't accept your authority. How we all tend to go into excess with our coping patterns when we're under stress, even if they're not working for us. And how some people have a pattern of taking all the responsibility for a situation themselves rather than asking others to pitch in. I hope you found the lessons and coaching useful from this session. I look forward to reconnecting when I run the next one. Bye for now.